The night hung heavy over the Texas plains. Ethan Grayson, a retired soldier who had seen enough battlefields to last several lifetimes, sat in the quiet solitude of his small, isolated ranch. The world beyond the borders of his land seemed far away, too far to care about anymore. After the tragedy that had torn his life apart years ago, he had chosen seclusion, cutting off ties with the rest of humanity. There was only the earth now, only the endless stretch of land and sky, punctuated by the occasional howl of coyotes and the rustle of wind through the dry grass. It was the perfect kind of isolation for someone like Ethan, the sort of solitude that allowed a man to heal, or at least to forget. Or so he thought. Tonight, though, something felt different. The air was still, almost thick with expectation. The usual sounds of night, crickets, the distant calls of birds, were gone, replaced by a chilling silence. The wind, which had once carried the faint scent of earth and sagebrush, now felt almost unnatural. It stirred uneasily, like it was hiding something. Ethan stood up from his porch and gazed out across the land. There was nothing to see. Just the distant silhouette of the barn and the long, empty stretch of dirt road that led nowhere. But something in the air tugged at him. Something in his gut telling him that tonight would not be like the others. The faintest rustle came from the garden, barely audible, but it was enough. Ethan's sharp eyes snapped in that direction, his hand instinctively reaching for the rifle slung over his shoulder. His training kicked in. Every fiber of his being told him that something was wrong. He moved quickly, his boots crunching softly on the wooden floor of the porch. As he crept toward the garden, the moonlight cast long shadows over the rows of vegetables, making them look like ghostly outlines in the dark. And then, he saw her. A figure, slender, pale, and moving with a grace that seemed out of place in this desolate, lonely part of the world. She was standing by the edge of his garden, holding something tightly in her arms, though it was hard to tell what it was. She was moving cautiously, as if afraid of being noticed. Her face was hidden in shadow, but there was something about her that didn't sit right with Ethan. He didn't move. He just watched, waiting, calculating his next move. Every part of his body was on alert. The woman didn't belong here. There were no other houses for miles. Why would anyone be here, alone, at this hour? He stepped forward slowly, his boots silent on the cracked earth. As he neared, he could make out more details. She was still, her body tense, almost as if she was waiting for something, or someone. The light from the porch caught her face for a brief moment, and Ethan felt his pulse quicken. She wasn't like anyone he had ever seen. Her skin was an unnatural shade of pale, almost luminous under the moon's glow. Her eyes, when they flicked up to meet his, were not human. They were an unsettling shade of violet, glowing faintly in the dark. There was an alien quality to her, something almost otherworldly. Ethan froze, a chill creeping up his spine. The woman didn't move. She didn't speak. She just stood there, her eyes locked on him, as if weighing him. The tension between them was palpable. For a moment, neither of them moved. Ethan's grip tightened around his rifle, but he didn't raise it. Not yet. His mind was spinning with questions. Who was she? What was she doing here? And why did she seem so familiar, yet so completely out of place? Something about her made him uneasy, but there was also a strange pull, an odd sense of urgency. Who are you? Ethan's voice was low but firm, cutting through the silence. The woman didn't answer right away. She just stood there, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. Her eyes never left him. She didn't seem surprised or scared, just resigned. I don't mean any harm, she finally said, her voice barely a whisper, but there was a tremor in it. Please, help me. The words were simple, but they struck Ethan like a physical blow. Help her? Help who? Help what? She shifted slightly, and Ethan caught a glimpse of what she was holding, a bundle wrapped tightly in cloth. It was too small to be just a bag of vegetables, too delicate. He didn't know what was inside, but something about the way she held it made his heart race. His instincts screamed at him to be cautious. But there was something else there too. Something in the pit of his stomach that made him want to help. He hadn't felt that pull in years. "Help you with what?" Ethan asked again, his tone more demanding this time, the weight of his military experience in his voice. The woman flinched slightly, her eyes darting to the sides as if expecting someone or something to be watching them. Then she spoke again, her voice shaky. "Please. They'll come for me. For us. I can't do this alone. Please." Her words were a jumble, and Ethan couldn't make sense of them, but the urgency in her voice was undeniable. She wasn't asking for help in the way one would expect from a simple traveler or lost soul. There was something more, something deeper to her plea. Before he could respond, a faint rustle from the trees caught his attention. It was almost imperceptible, but Ethan's senses had been honed by years of vigilance. Something, or someone, was out there, in the shadows. Ethan's grip tightened around his rifle, his instincts screaming at him that this was not an ordinary encounter. He didn't know who she was or what she wanted, but he knew one thing for sure: this wasn't going to end quietly. Ethan held his rifle steady, his finger resting just above the trigger. His eyes, cold and unyielding, remained fixed on the woman in front of him. There was something about her, something that didn't sit right. His instincts, honed through years of survival in combat zones, told him to be wary, to question everything, especially someone who showed up unannounced in the dead of night. He had learned the hard way to trust no one. But this was different. She wasn't the first stranger he had encountered in his solitude, but there was an unmistakable urgency in her presence, a desperation that weighed heavy in the air. Ethan's grip on his weapon tightened, but his gaze softened ever so slightly as he studied her. The woman stood still, her figure fragile in the moonlight, trembling slightly as if every muscle in her body was holding her together. Her clothes were torn, ragged, and she was barefoot, the soles of her feet caked in dirt. But it was her face that held Ethan's attention. The deep lines etched into her skin, the exhaustion that clung to her eyes, and the desperate look in them that told him she hadn't come here by choice. The bundle she carried in her arms was small, but wrapped tightly. His mind immediately raced. Was it a child, or something else? He took a step forward, his boots crunching against the dry earth. He was close enough now to see the fear in her eyes. He could hear the raggedness of her breath, the trembling of her chest as she fought to stay calm. The smell of the night air seemed to hang heavier, as if nature itself had stilled, waiting for something to break. "Explain yourself," Ethan said, his voice low, cold, and steady. His finger hovered over the trigger, but he didn't want to shoot. Not yet. There was something more important than pulling that trigger. Understanding. He needed to understand why she was here. What she wanted. Who she was. The woman's mouth opened, but no words came out immediately. Her eyes flickered between Ethan and the dark yard behind her, as if searching for something. Or someone. She took a shaky breath, and when she spoke, her voice was raw, cracked, like it hadn't been used in days, maybe weeks. "Please. Help me," she gasped, her hands trembling as she gripped the bundle even tighter. "My child. She's hungry." Ethan's heart stilled. The words hung in the air like a heavy fog, suffocating the space between them. A child. Was it true? Was she lying? His thoughts collided in a jumble of suspicion and hesitation. He couldn't afford to trust anyone, especially not someone who appeared at his doorstep in the middle of the night. But there was something about her. Her voice, the pleading desperation in it, stirred something deep inside him. His eyes flicked to the bundle she was holding, but it was too tightly wrapped for him to make out anything specific. His hand wavered slightly on the rifle as he struggled to keep his composure. The seconds stretched into an eternity, thick with the weight of his decision. The air felt heavier now, almost suffocating, as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for him to make the choice. Was this some sort of trick? Or was it genuine? He couldn't tell. He had to be cautious, but there was a nagging feeling that he couldn't ignore. This woman needed help, Or at least, she seemed to. Then came a sound, a rustle in the darkness that caused his body to tense. It was barely audible, like the whisper of the wind, but there was something off about it. The rustling came again, more distinct this time, and Ethan's senses went on high alert. He spun around, eyes scanning the edges of his property. Two figures emerged from the shadows. Small, frail. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. Two children. A boy and a girl, both thin, their faces drawn and pale in the moonlight. Their eyes were wide with a mix of fear and curiosity, darting between Ethan and the woman. They looked lost, hungry, and scared. His gaze flicked over them, but it didn't take long for him to realize something. Something was wrong. The children were quiet, moving hesitantly toward the woman, almost as if they didn't want to be seen. Ethan's grip on his rifle tightened, but his heart sank as he watched them. The boy, no older than 5, was clutching something in his tiny hands, something that looked odd. Ethan squinted. It was a small, weathered potato. The boy looked up at him, his face pale and wide-eyed. He took a step forward, his feet dragging against the dirt, his eyes never leaving Ethan's. Ethan's breath caught in his chest as the boy slowly extended the potato towards him, his hands shaking with fear. The gesture was so innocent, so fragile, it caught him off guard. The boy's voice broke the silence, soft and tentative. "Did you hurt my mom?" The question was simple, yet it hit Ethan like a freight train. He froze, his mind scrambling for an answer. He wasn't prepared for this. The innocence in the boy's eyes pierced through him, stirring a protective instinct he thought he had buried long ago. This wasn't a typical confrontation. The child was asking him if he had harmed his mother. Ethan's chest tightened as he searched for the right words. "No," he said quietly, his voice rough. "I didn't hurt her." The boy's eyes studied him, as if trying to gauge the truth in his words. Ethan could see the fear in the child's eyes, but there was something else. Something deeper. A silent plea for safety, for assurance that they were not in danger. Ethan felt his resolve faltering, just a little. His rifle still rested in his hands, but the tension in his body started to ease. The boy's words, the sincerity in them, it was enough to make him question his own certainty. The woman, who had been standing still, seemed to relax, though it was brief. Her face softened just a fraction, but the exhaustion never left her eyes. She stepped closer to the children, her movements slow and careful. She wasn't just looking at Ethan. She was assessing the situation, gauging whether they were safe here. Ethan stood tall, his body still tense, his eyes scanning the yard. But something had shifted in him. He wasn't sure what it was, but his instincts, which had kept him alive through wars and conflicts, were no longer screaming at him to run. Instead, they were telling him to act, to do something, to make a decision. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. He didn't want to trust her. He didn't want to trust anyone. Not anymore. But the desperation in her voice, the fear in the eyes of the children, the fragile gesture of the boy offering him the potato, it was enough to stir something within him that he hadn't felt in a long time. His hand slowly lowered the rifle. Ethan stood at the threshold of his door, his rifle still held loosely in his hand, but his mind was a storm of conflicting thoughts. His instincts screamed at him to send them away, to shut the door and stay safely locked in the solitude he had come to rely on. Trusting anyone, let alone a stranger, let alone this woman with 2 children, was dangerous, a risk he wasn't sure he was ready to take. But as he stood there, watching them, something shifted inside him. The woman's eyes, filled with exhaustion and desperation, held his gaze in a way that made him feel as though she could see straight into him, into the core of his isolation. The boy's trembling hand offering that small potato, the fragile way the girl clung to her mother, the silent plea in their faces, it all tugged at something deep within him, something he had long buried beneath years of self-imposed isolation. His thoughts swirled, each second weighing heavily on him. He could still tell them to leave, to walk into the night. But there was something about this moment, something more than just survival, more than just instinct. It was the look in the children's eyes, the way they were clinging to their mother like she was their only anchor. Ethan could see that they were desperate. They weren't here to harm him. They were here because they had nowhere else to go. "Get inside," he finally said, his voice rough, filled with uncertainty. But there was no turning back now. He stepped aside, making room for them to enter. "Now. And stay quiet." The woman didn't hesitate. Mira, as she had introduced herself, nodded slowly, her movements cautious, almost as though she feared the offer itself. She walked past him quickly, her head lowered, her eyes darting around the interior of the house with the wariness of someone who had learned to survive by always being on edge. She was like a cornered animal, tense and ready to bolt at the slightest sign of danger. But she moved inside nonetheless, leading the children into the warmth of the house. The boy and girl entered after her, their small bodies still trembling from the cold night air. When they crossed the threshold, it was as though they had crossed into another world entirely. The dim light of the old lamp illuminated their faces, their eyes wide with wonder as they looked around. They hadn't seen light like this in days, if not weeks. They hadn't smelled warmth and comfort in so long, it seemed. The faint scent of stale bread in the air seemed to excite them, the warmth of the kitchen pulling them in like a beacon in the dark. Mira hesitated, standing just inside the door for a moment as if unsure of what to do next. Her eyes scanned the room, her gaze flicking over the furniture, the peeling wallpaper, the dusty corners of the old house. It wasn't much, but to them, it must have been a mansion. She glanced back at Ethan briefly, her eyes still filled with caution, but also a hint of something else. Gratitude? Relief? It was hard to tell, but it was there. Ethan didn't know what to make of it. He couldn't remember the last time someone had looked at him like that. It wasn't trust. No, not yet. But it was something. Something he hadn't seen in so long. Mira moved further into the room, her eyes lingering on the small wooden table in the center of the kitchen. Ethan had no idea what she thought as she glanced at it, but he knew the table was the only place where the three of them could sit, and that alone seemed to pull her in. Without a word, Mira set the bundle she had been carrying down on the floor. The children stood near her, unsure of what to do. Then, Mira reached into the bundle and pulled out a few small pieces of bread, hard, stale bread. She broke them into smaller chunks, but she didn't eat any herself. Her first instinct was to feed her children. The boy and the girl looked at the bread with wide, hungry eyes, as if it were the most precious thing they had ever seen. The girl's small hands shook as she reached out, grabbing the bread and bringing it to her mouth with an urgency that made Ethan's stomach tighten. The boy followed suit, shoving the bread into his mouth, hardly pausing to chew before taking another piece. Ethan stood in the corner, watching them, his mind still processing the events unfolding in front of him. The two children ate like they had never been fed a proper meal in their lives, as if they were starved for something more than food. Maybe it wasn't just nourishment they were craving. Maybe it was the feeling of being cared for, of being seen. Mira sat down at the table, her gaze moving from her children to Ethan. She didn't speak right away. Instead, she watched the children as they ate. There was a soft tenderness in her eyes that seemed to contrast sharply with her guarded, defensive demeanor from moments before. For a moment, Ethan wondered if she had ever known peace, if she had ever had the luxury of sitting down at a table like this, watching her children eat without fear. The silence in the room was thick with unspoken words. It was the first silence Ethan had experienced in a long time that didn't feel suffocating. The soft sound of the children eating, the rustle of their small hands grabbing at the bread, was oddly soothing. He hadn't realized how much he had missed it. How much he had missed the feeling of a house no longer empty, no longer just a shell. The house felt full now. Not with noise or chatter, but with something far rarer. Life. As Mira's children ate, Ethan leaned against the counter, his eyes flickering over the scene before him. He didn't know what he expected. He had no idea what he was hoping for. But there, in the quiet of the kitchen, with the warmth of the light spilling out into the corners of the room, something shifted in him. He wasn't alone anymore. The decision to bring them in hadn't been easy. It had come after much internal struggle, after countless moments of hesitation. But now, with the children safe for the moment, with Mira finally able to sit down and breathe for the first time in what seemed like forever, Ethan felt something he hadn't felt in years. Something that had been buried deep within him. Hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough to change everything. Mira glanced up at him then, her eyes no longer just searching for danger but looking at him with something that could almost be called trust. A small flicker, but it was there. Ethan couldn't bring himself to smile. Not yet. But for the first time in a long time, he felt something stir in his chest. A quiet, tentative connection. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But right now, he didn't feel quite as alone. The days blurred together for Ethan. At first, he had thought bringing Mira and her children into his home was nothing more than a momentary act of mercy, a fleeting decision driven by something he couldn't quite name. But as the days passed, something deeper began to take root. The small house, once silent and lonely, now hummed with the faint noise of life. It was a life that wasn't his own, yet it was becoming increasingly intertwined with his own. Mira, despite her initial wariness, had settled into a quiet rhythm. She had not demanded anything from him. Instead, she worked. She worked tirelessly alongside him, offering her help with tasks he had long done alone. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Mira found herself standing by the garden, pulling weeds from the soil. Ethan stood nearby, his hands resting on his hips as he watched her with a gaze that had shifted over the weeks, from suspicion to quiet admiration. She was unlike anyone he had met before, a woman who carried the weight of the world on her shoulders, yet still had the strength to push forward, to help. The children, too, had begun to blossom in their own way. The boy, once so timid and fearful, had started running around the farm with laughter in his voice, his small feet kicking up dust as he chased after chickens. The girl, her wide eyes now a little less fearful, had taken to sitting with Ethan during the evenings, helping him tend to the small flock of chickens. She had learned quickly how to handle them, and Ethan found himself oddly grateful for the noise, for the presence of children who filled the silence that had haunted him for so long. It wasn't long before Mira shared the story of her past. One evening, after a long day of work, as they sat together in the dimly lit kitchen, Mira's voice broke the comfortable silence. Her words were hesitant at first, but as she spoke, the weight of her tale seemed to settle over them both. She told Ethan about where she came from, about how her people, those like her, weren't here to harm anyone. In fact, they had never wanted to be a threat. They were hunted, captured, and tested by those who saw them as dangerous, as anomalies. They weren't here to invade or destroy. They were simply running, trying to escape the nightmare that had become their lives. "I've lost so many," Mira said quietly, her eyes distant, as if she could see the faces of those who had been taken from her. "I thought there would be safety, a place to hide. But every time we thought we found peace, they came. They always came." The pain in her voice was raw, and Ethan felt something stir within him. He knew that feeling, the constant dread of being hunted, of being forced to flee with no place to call home. He had known that kind of loss, that kind of heartache. The scars were deep, and he had thought for so long that they were his alone. But now, sitting across from Mira, he realized that perhaps he was not as alone as he had believed. She had suffered too, in ways he could not fully understand. "I know what it's like," Ethan said, his voice rough, his gaze focused on the flickering light of the stove. "To be hunted, to have no place to go. I've been there." Mira's eyes met his then, and for the first time she seemed to see him, not just as the man who had offered them shelter, but as someone who understood, someone who carried his own burdens. The bond between them, once fragile and tentative, began to grow stronger with each passing day. Mira proved herself not just as a survivor, but as someone who could help. She learned quickly, never hesitating to lend a hand with the crops, with the chickens, with whatever needed doing. Her work ethic was unwavering, and Ethan found himself relying on her more and more. He would catch himself smiling when she offered her assistance without asking, when she didn't wait for him to tell her what needed to be done. And it wasn't just her. The children were changing too. The boy, who had once clung to his mother in fear, now ran freely across the farm, laughing and calling to Ethan as he helped with the chores. The girl had stopped flinching whenever Ethan spoke to her. She was no longer the wary child who had once stared at him from a distance. Now she worked alongside him, quietly chatting as they cleaned the barn. It was strange for Ethan, this slow shift from isolation to connection, from quiet solitude to a new kind of togetherness that he hadn't known in years. He found himself growing accustomed to their presence, to the soft rustle of feet in the house, the gentle murmur of voices in the evening. At first, he had struggled with it. The noise, the movement, it had been foreign to him. But now, it felt almost natural. He no longer walked into a house that echoed with emptiness. He no longer spent his nights staring at the walls, wondering what he had done to deserve this solitude. Instead, he now had the sound of Mira's children's laughter to fill the spaces between his thoughts. And Mira, with her quiet strength, had become a constant in his days, someone he trusted in ways he had never thought possible. The walls that had once held him captive in his own silence were beginning to crumble. And though he had never meant for any of this to happen, never intended to let anyone back into his life, it was happening. He was changing. They were changing him. And he couldn't stop it. Nor did he want to. It wasn't a grand revelation. It was simple, really. Trust had been built, not through grand gestures, but through the quiet moments, the shared work in the fields, the laughter that now echoed in the corners of his home, the soft conversations held by the fire. And with that trust, a bond had formed. A family, not by blood, but by choice. Ethan couldn't remember when it had happened exactly, but he knew one thing for sure. He was no longer alone. And for the first time in years, that thought didn't scare him. It felt like hope. It was just another evening when Ethan decided to take his usual walk around the perimeter of his property, checking the fences and making sure everything was secure. The quiet had become something he treasured. The peace of solitude that had once felt like a curse now felt like a gift. He moved silently through the shadows, each step deliberate, until something stopped him dead in his tracks. A faint but unmistakable sign caught his attention. Tracks. Fresh ones. They were not animal prints, but human. Too deliberate. Too organized. His pulse quickened as he followed the trail, the sense of unease growing with every step. It wasn't long before he saw the flash of something metallic in the distance. Equipment, strange tools, things that didn't belong in the wilderness. A group of people was out there, hunting, searching, and their movements were calculated, methodical. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He knew exactly what this meant. His mind raced through scenarios as his worst fears began to take shape. They had found him. They had found Mira and the children. His mind flashed back to her words from just days ago. They're always looking for us. They won't stop until they've found us all. As if on cue, Mira's voice rang out from behind him, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and recognition. They're here. Ethan's blood ran cold. There was no denying it now. Mira's people, the ones who had been hunted, tested, and experimented on, were being hunted again. And this time, there was nowhere left for them to run. A decision had to be made. Quickly. Ethan's instincts kicked into high gear. He could feel his pulse hammering in his ears as he tried to make sense of the situation, to plan their next move. But there was no time for hesitation, no time for second-guessing. Without a word, he turned and ran toward the house, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the adrenaline flooding his veins as he entered, moving with a singular purpose. Mira and the children were already inside, huddled together in the kitchen, their faces pale with fear. "Listen to me," he said, his voice low but firm. "You have to go to the basement. Now, stay hidden, stay quiet. Don't come out unless I tell you to." Mira's eyes searched his face for a moment, the same unspoken trust passing between them that had been building over the past weeks. She didn't hesitate. She gathered the children close, her hands shaking as she ushered them toward the basement door. Ethan watched them disappear into the shadows, the weight of the responsibility settling heavily on his shoulders. Once they were safely below ground, Ethan moved with a calm he didn't feel. He knew the danger they faced. He knew what would happen if those people found them, if they found Mira and the kids. It was a terrifying thought, one he didn't want to entertain. But he had no choice now. They were here, and he had to protect them. The soft hum of a distant engine broke the silence, followed by the unmistakable crackle of walkie-talkies and the sharp flash of a red light that swept across the house. The searchers were getting closer. Ethan's heart raced as he surveyed the room, quickly scanning for anything that could be used as a weapon, a way to defend his home, his family. His hand found the rifle, the cold metal comforting in his grasp. He positioned himself by the front window, crouching low to remain hidden, his eyes darting to the shadows outside. The soft sound of footsteps reached his ears, followed by voices, muffled but unmistakably human. He could see the figures now, moving with precision, their eyes scanning the area for any sign of life. His mind raced, calculating their next move, the distance between them and him. Suddenly, the door creaked open. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he held his position, waiting. His mind was a blur of strategy, of calculated risks. He knew that this was it. This was the moment he had been dreading. A flash of movement outside the window caught his attention. One of the searchers was standing close to the house, peering through the darkened window. Ethan gripped his rifle tighter, praying that he wouldn't be spotted. The footsteps continued, and then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the searchers stopped. Silence fell over the property like a heavy blanket. Ethan could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. Then, the unmistakable sound of a voice shouted from outside, "Clear!" Ethan's heart skipped a beat. They were closer now, much closer. The battle to protect his home and the people inside was about to begin. Without hesitation, Ethan made his move. He darted to the back door, his heart hammering in his chest, and took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. He knew that there was no way to avoid the confrontation. They had found him. They had found them all. The door crashed open, and the first of the searchers entered. Ethan fired without a second thought, the deafening blast of the rifle ringing in the air. The force of the shot sent the intruder stumbling back, his hand clutching his shoulder. Ethan didn't wait for him to recover. He moved quickly, firing again, each shot hitting its mark, the adrenaline pushing him forward as the sound of footsteps grew louder, and the searchers began to realize they weren't alone. The battle that ensued was brutal, each second stretching out into what felt like an eternity. Ethan fought with every skill he had learned in years of solitude, his movements sharp and precise. He wasn't going to let them take his home. He wasn't going to let them take Mira, the children, or the fragile peace he had found with them. As the battle raged on, Ethan's mind remained focused. There was no turning back now. He had made his decision, and he would protect them with everything he had. The night after the confrontation felt like a strange and unnerving calm had settled over the house. The sounds of distant footsteps and the adrenaline of the fight seemed to have faded, replaced by an overwhelming silence. Mira sat near the dimly lit kitchen, her eyes distant, reflecting the weight of the decision that lay ahead. She had been on the run for so long that it had become a part of her, something she couldn't escape. The fear, the constant movement, the ever-present danger. She had never known peace. And yet, tonight, after the chaos of the battle and the shelter of Ethan's protection, the idea of staying, of finally finding a place where they could rest, was something she had never allowed herself to entertain before. But now, there was no denying the tension in the air. Ethan's quiet presence filled the room as he moved through the house, checking the locks, looking out the windows, but his mind was elsewhere. He watched Mira as she sat, her hands clasped tightly together, her thoughts clearly far away. The children were asleep in the corner, their bodies curled up together, exhaustion finally giving them a moment of peace. It wasn't until the quiet settled in that Mira's voice broke through. Her words were soft, tinged with the weight of her past, her experiences. "We have to leave," she said, her eyes never leaving the children. "We can't let you face danger because of us. I won't have it." Ethan's gaze shifted to the kids. His heart tightened. For the first time in months, they were finally at rest. Their bodies relaxed in sleep, free from the nightmares that had chased them for so long. For the first time, they were not running. The thought of them leaving, of Mira and the children disappearing into the night again, suddenly seemed like an unbearable weight. Ethan's grip on the rifle he had been cleaning tightened. He couldn't let them go. Not now. Not after everything they had been through. His voice was steady, but there was an unshakable resolve in it as he looked Mira in the eyes. You don't have to run anymore. You don't have to be afraid anymore. His voice softened as he took a step closer to her, the words heavy with meaning. Here, with me, I can protect you. I can protect all of you. You can stay. Mira's breath hitched as she absorbed his words. It wasn't that she hadn't heard offers of help before. It wasn't that people hadn't promised her safety. But every time, those promises had been broken. Those who had offered their help had either betrayed her or abandoned her in the end. She had learned long ago that trusting others came with a cost. The pain of loss had become too much to bear. But now, here was Ethan, offering something she didn't know how to accept. The weight of his words pressed into her chest, and for the first time in years, Mira allowed herself to feel the briefest spark of hope. Could she trust him? Could she trust anyone again? Her eyes flickered to the children, sleeping so peacefully for the first time in as long as she could remember. Could she give them a chance at a life without fear? Could she finally stop running? A part of her wanted to say no. A part of her wanted to keep running. To leave this place and protect her children in the only way she knew how. By staying one step ahead of the danger. But another part of her, the part that had been buried deep inside for so long, wanted to believe. For the first time, she longed for something more than survival. She didn't have to answer right away. The choice was hers, and for once, she could make it without fear of being hunted down. With a slow, hesitant motion, she looked up at Ethan. Her eyes, usually guarded and wary, softened as she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I've spent my life running, Ethan. I've always been afraid that if I stayed, I'd only bring more danger to those around me. I've never known anything else. But... She paused, the words coming harder now, as if she were unwrapping layers of a wound long kept hidden. But maybe, just maybe, I can believe you. Maybe this time, we can stop. Ethan stood still, watching her with a quiet understanding. He knew that this wasn't just a decision about staying or leaving. This was a moment of trust, of vulnerability, that Mira had never allowed herself to experience. She wasn't just choosing to stay. She was choosing to trust. Choosing to let her guard down for the first time in years. Choosing to believe that Ethan wasn't like the others. That this place could be a safe haven. He nodded slowly, his expression softening. You don't have to run anymore, Mira. You and your children are safe here. The words hung in the air between them, a promise that was both fragile and powerful. Mira swallowed hard, and then, slowly, she nodded. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe in something other than fear. And in that moment, she knew that no matter what came next, they would be okay. They would stay. Together. The first rays of dawn broke through the horizon, casting a soft golden light over the fields. The air was cool, and the earth beneath their feet was still damp with the remnants of the night's chill. Ethan stood at the edge of the field, watching as Mira and the children worked beside him. It was a moment he had never expected to experience, a moment of peace. The harsh winds of uncertainty had finally given way to something more stable, something real. Mira moved with a sense of purpose now, her steps sure and confident as she worked alongside Ethan, her eyes no longer darting around in fear or suspicion. For the first time in what felt like forever, she was free from the constant weight of survival. The weight that had defined her every action, every thought. It was gone. She was no longer on the run. No longer bound by the shadow of the past. She was simply here, in this moment, with the people she had come to trust. As the morning unfolded, the sound of laughter broke the quiet. The children, now more vibrant than ever, ran around the porch, chasing each other in gleeful abandon. Their giggles floated through the air, a symphony of innocence and joy. Ethan couldn't help but watch them, a sense of warmth filling his chest. The children, who had once been guarded and wary, now seemed like any other kids, enjoying the simple pleasure of being alive. It was a sight that brought a sense of hope he hadn't realized he'd been missing. They had found their place. Mira stood next to him, her gaze following the children. Her posture was relaxed, no longer tense. As she looked at Ethan, something shifted in her expression. An unspoken connection, something that had grown between them over time. She turned to him, her eyes soft, but filled with something deeper than just gratitude. She reached out slowly, taking his hand in hers. It was a gesture of trust, no longer a protective grasp, but one of mutual understanding, a quiet promise that, for once, there was no need for fear. Ethan's heart beat a little faster as he squeezed her hand gently. He had never imagined his life would change like this. He had never imagined that one day he would be standing here, in the midst of a family, not just with the woman and children he had taken in, but with people who had become a part of his life in ways he hadn't even understood until now. "No more running," Ethan said softly, his voice low but steady. "This is your home now." Mira nodded, her grip on his hand tightening ever so slightly. She didn't need to say anything more. The words had been said, and for the first time, they weren't just promises. They were a reality. Together, they had built something new, something stronger than the fear and the loss that had defined their pasts. Neither of them knew exactly what the future would hold. There were still dangers out there, still shadows lurking on the edges of their lives. But for the first time in so long, they weren't alone. They had each other. And that was enough. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting its warmth across the land, Ethan, Mira, and the children continued to work together. The bond between them was unspoken, but undeniable. The world might still be uncertain, but for now, they had each other. And that was more than enough to face whatever lay ahead. This was a new beginning. And they would face it together. Across the galaxies, across time itself. You've found your way here. Where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments. Let's see how far across the universe our community reaches. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications, because tomorrow's episode will take you even deeper into the unknown. You won't want to miss it.